Greetings, YouTube. Today's piece about Native Americans and how, for the most part, white culture has attempted to erase them. Um, the sheer invisibility of Native people leads to some very warped perspectives about contemporary Native life. 40% of respondents did not think that Native people still existed, while 59% agreed that the United States is guilty of committing genocide against Native Americans. Only 36% agreed that Native Americans experience significant discrimination today, meaning nearly two-thirds of the public perceive Native Americans as experiencing little to no oppression or structural racism, reclaiming the Native Truth Report on how the American public reviews Native Americans. Additionally, respondents also held stereotypical and contradicting views that Native Americans are both poor and flushed with casino money, both spiritually focused and addicted to drugs and alcohol, and both resilient and dependent upon government benefits. Many participants expressed these misconceptions and even resented that Native Americans get quote-unquote free money, with one respondent stating they get a monthly stipend if you are at least 1/16th Native American. Yeah, not much of a compensation for having your entire culture almost completely wiped out by white people. Now, I actually happen to be lucky enough to know some Native Americans, and they have completely assimilated themselves into white culture, uh, but they are still active in their native culture. They go to powwows regularly. They're in constant contact with fellow members of their group, and they are active in drum circles. I think they're a little less active now because one of the key members, unfortunately, recently passed away due to an illness. But I'm not sure. But my wife was actually invited to join in, even though my wife is not Native American. She was joined because she was friends with the family. So she got an opportunity to play in a drum circle, even though she is, like me, the whitest white person that's ever come out of White Town. My wife can actually trace her family history all the way back to the first ships that landed here. Yeah, with the Pilgrims. Yeah, she can Mayflower. My wife can actually trace her family all the way back. My family showed up during the 19th century with the need for cheap labor from Europe. We were all coal miners. Um, and I have always been aware, as far as I can know, as an adult, of the plight of Native Americans and what the white culture, both those that came directly from Europe initially, and the white culture that has grown out of that since then, the Europeans that have become Americans. But as a kid, as up through high school, I knew very little about Native Americans. I had some idea of the technology to live with because I was a technology bug, but the history I learned about Native Americans pretty much ended with Thanksgiving. Seriously, I think they may have been mentioned in, like, we might have mentioned them in, like, the French and Indian War, simply because the name is in the war. So the concept that there were Native Americans involved in that war was kind of hard to ignore if you're going to talk about that war. But as far as American history, we petered out sometime around the American Revolution. I'm not even sure they mentioned the Civil War a whole lot. I know that there was nothing that could be viewed as even vaguely contemporary. We never talked about the First World War or the Second World War. And of course, we didn't talk about at all about how Native Americans existed all the way up through till the present. We didn't discuss the code talkers of World War II that helped us win in our war in Europe, because they had a code, their own language, that the Nazis couldn't break, and the Germans could, I mean, the Japanese couldn't break in the Pacific theater. They didn't really discuss that, which is horrible because they were key to our being able to pass information. They never discussed the fact that how we shoved the Native Americans from the East Coast to West along the Trail of Tears, and we've killed millions of Native Americans since the first Europeans showed up here. We don't talk about how they're still being screwed over by state and federal governments. How poverty rates are higher, how addiction rates are higher, how healthcare failings are higher, because we took everything from them, shoved them into places where they did not originally come from. So they had to readjust their entire way of life, those that survived to get there. and just ignored them for the most part. That we've never made true reparations to the Native Americans. Heck, we've never made true reparations to the African people that we brought here as slaves and then ignored for the most part after uh, emancipation. Let alone, of course, we weren't using them again as prison slave labor and oppressing them. The United States is built on a history of slavery and genocide, and we attempted to wipe out millions of people that lived here. Peoples that had a history on the North American continent that went back 15,000 years. They had claimed this land as their own. They didn't use the land the same way that Europeans used the land, but that didn't mean it wasn't their land. And some of them were even willing to share their lands, but they didn't quite grasp, I don't think, how the Europeans use land and how they view land when the Europeans showed up. Because the Europeans are very much, this is mine, and you can never touch it again. The Native Americans weren't cheated out of things. They knew they were getting the raw deal. They just didn't have a choice. They weren't in a position to negotiate a good treaty. And that they have been able to take advantage of certain of the laws that govern reservations, such as the casinos that were mentioned in the opening piece, is just smart on their part. Get a little back from the people that took so much from them. But it's never going to return the millions of Native Americans that were killed. It's never going to repair the holes that we punched through their culture, their society. The years where we took their children away and put them into schools and made them pretend to be white people. Beat them if they spoke their own languages. We did those things. And we haven't made amends for them. We don't even talk about them. And we pretend that the Native Americans are still the bad guys in a lot of our history books. The most egregious example of that is when some Mormons wiped out a group of white people coming west and blamed it on the Native Americans. The Mormons in question were not Native Americans, I should point out. The Mormons in question were also white people. We've been doing this for centuries. We've erased their histories. We still don't teach it in schools the way it should be taught. But then again, it paints us in a bad light now, doesn't it? And white people don't seem to be comfortable with painting themselves in a bad light, of facing up to what they and those with their skin color have done in the past. And the benefits they have reaped from those things, even if they didn't do it. We're not good at that. And Native Americans suffer for it even today. But they're still here, folks. They still have a history and a culture. And it should be taught. And it isn't. And that's a crying shame. So, if any of you have kids out there, maybe you can find out what their schools teach them about Native culture. And ask why they don't teach it more. Why don't they teach all of it? Not just the highlights, not just the pleasant little meal held at Thanksgiving. Because we need to know all the truth if we are going to move forward, and we're going to admit to our failings and try to do better.